I don't know why I felt like something was off that morning. Maybe it was the way Sherry smiled as she handed me my coffee, just a little too bright for 7 a.m., or the way her phone never left her side anymore. I should have brushed it off as nothing, but something in her eyes, it gnawed at me all day. Sherry and I had been married for 7 years, and like any couple, we had our ups and downs. Lately, though, life felt like a high-pressure sales pitch. Everything from how she dressed to the small lies I caught her telling seemed rehearsed. I convinced myself I was paranoid. Working from home while she juggled her demanding job at the marketing firm meant I had too much time to overthink. Then the contractor came into our lives. We were finally remodeling the outdated master bathroom, a project Sherry had been pushing for years. Enter Patrick, the smooth-talking contractor who seemed to bring a little too much charm along with his toolbox. He was the kind of guy who could sell snow to a polar bear, tall, confident, always smiling just enough to make you wonder what he wasn't saying. I thought nothing of it at first. The guy was good at his job, and I was buried in freelance projects of my own. Still, as the weeks went by, I noticed Sherry spending more time discussing design choices with Patrick. More time than seemed necessary. One night, I came downstairs to find the two of them standing close in the kitchen. Sherry laughed at something he said, her hand brushing his arm. My chest tightened. "You guys need something?" I asked, making my presence known. Patrick turned, his grin unwavering. "Just finalizing the tile options. You've got yourself a woman with great taste, Jack." "Yeah, I know," I replied, forcing a smile. Sherry shot me a quick look, almost like she was gauging my reaction, before she changed the subject. I told myself it was all in my head. Then came the phone call. It was a Saturday morning, and Sherry was at yoga, or so she said. The contractor's wife, a woman I'd never met, called out of the blue. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. "Mr. Meyer, I thought you should know something about Patrick," she began. My stomach flipped. "What are you talking about?" She paused, her voice lowering as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "I think it's better if we discuss this in person." I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my mind spinning with questions. What did she know? Why would the contractor's wife call me? Was there something Sherry wasn't telling me? I convinced myself it was a misunderstanding. It had to be. Sherry loved me, she wouldn't risk everything we'd built together. Right? By the time Sherry came home that evening, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. She was smiling, chatting about yoga, and everything seemed so normal. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to change forever. That Sunday, the air felt heavier than usual, like a storm was about to break but hadn't quite decided when. Sherry left the house mid-morning, saying she was meeting a friend for coffee. The way she casually kissed my cheek and grabbed her keys felt rehearsed. I didn't question her, but my gut was in knots. At exactly noon, I met Patrick's wife at a quiet cafe on the other side of town. Her name was Linda, and her appearance caught me off guard. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her dark hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her eyes darted around the room as though she was bracing for an ambush. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice low. She stirred a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "Why am I here, Linda?" I asked, leaning forward. My patience was paper-thin. "You call me out of nowhere, hinting there's something I need to know about Patrick. Just say it." She hesitated, staring into her cup like the answers were written in the tea leaves. Then, she exhaled sharply. "I think Patrick is involved with someone," she said, glancing at me meaningfully. My heart sank. "What do you mean by involved? Spit it out." She looked up, her eyes locking with mine. "I think it's your wife." I froze, her words hitting me like a slap. For a moment, the cafe's ambient noise, the clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversations, faded to silence. "That's ridiculous," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Linda shook her head. I didn't want to believe it either, but I've seen things. Text messages on his phone. Receipts for dinners he claimed were work-related. And every time I ask him about your house, he suddenly gets defensive or changes the subject. My stomach churned. "Do you have proof?" Linda hesitated again, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. She slid it across the table to me, and my hand trembled as I opened it. It was a hotel receipt. Patrick's name was on it, along with a date from 3 weeks ago. The room was booked for 2 guests. "I'm not jumping to conclusions," she said quickly. "But it doesn't sit right with me." "Does it with you?" I stared at the paper, my mind racing. 3 weeks ago, Sherry told me she'd been working late on a marketing pitch for a new client. She even texted me photos of her desk, papers spread out like evidence. But now, this receipt made everything feel like a lie. I pushed the paper back toward Linda. "This doesn't prove anything. There could be a dozen explanations for this." She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look, I'm not here to ruin your life. But if you love your wife as much as I think you do, don't dismiss this. Dig deeper. You deserve to know the truth." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. When I got home, Sherry was in the kitchen making lunch, humming to herself like she didn't have a care in the world. Her phone sat on the counter, buzzing softly with notifications. "How was coffee with Karen?" I asked, watching her carefully. She turned, smiling easily. "Oh, it was great. We ended up at this cute little bakery downtown. She's doing well." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "That's good to hear." Sherry didn't notice the way my eyes flicked to her phone as she turned back to the stove. That night, after she went to bed, I stayed up late on the couch, scrolling through my thoughts like they were pages in a novel I didn't want to finish. Linda's words echoed in my mind, "Dig deeper. You deserve to know the truth." I didn't want to believe it. But a part of me knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I found out. By Monday morning, I felt like a detective trapped in my own life. Sherry acted as if everything was normal, chatting about her plans for the week, while I sat there quietly, nodding, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Linda's warning had lodged itself in my brain, refusing to leave. When Sherry left for work, I decided it was time to dig deeper, just as Linda had urged. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but the doubt was eating me alive. I started with her phone. Sherry had always been careful with it, never letting it out of her sight for too long, but that morning she'd left it charging on the nightstand while she showered. It was my chance. Heart pounding, I unlocked her phone using the passcode I'd memorized years ago, her birthdate. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but my stomach twisted as I scrolled through her messages. Most were mundane, texts from friends, work-related group chats. But when I got to a message thread labeled Pat, my chest tightened. The thread wasn't long, but it was off. "Pat, still thinking about Friday. That dress. Sherry, I can't believe you noticed. You're such a flirt. Pat, hard not to notice. You looked stunning, as always. Sherry, you're bad, winky face." I stared at the screen, my hand trembling. The messages were flirty, but not incriminating, not yet. Still, my mind jumped to the worst conclusions. I quickly copied the entire thread and sent it to my own email for safekeeping, then put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on my work. Every time I tried, those messages flashed in my mind. "You're such a flirt. Hard not to notice." What did it mean? Was it harmless banter, or was there something more? When Sherry came home that evening, I studied her like I was analyzing a crime scene. She looked radiant, her cheeks slightly flushed and her smile a little too perfect. "You seem happy," I said, keeping my tone light. She shrugged. "It was a good day. I finally got that campaign finalized. How about you? How's work going?" "Same old," I replied, forcing a smile. Later that night, after Sherry went to bed, I made another decision. If I wanted answers, I needed more evidence. That's when I ordered a small GPS tracker online. It would arrive in a couple of days, and I planned to attach it to Sherry's car. I hated myself for even considering it, but the doubt wouldn't let me rest. Over the next 2 days, I acted like everything was fine. I laughed at Sherry's jokes, helped her with the groceries, and even watched one of her favorite shows with her. But inside, I was a storm of emotions, torn between trust and suspicion. The GPS tracker arrived on Wednesday morning, a sleek little device that promised to help you know where your loved ones are at all times. The irony wasn't lost on me. That night, when Sherry was in the shower, I snuck outside and attached the tracker to the underside of her car. On Thursday, I finally got a hit. While Sherry was working late on a project, I opened the tracker app on my phone and saw that her car wasn't at the office. Instead, it was parked in a residential area I didn't recognize. My chest felt like it might collapse. I sat there staring at the map, the little red dot blinking tauntingly at me. She wasn't where she said she'd be. I couldn't let it go. I grabbed my keys and headed out, telling myself I'd just drive by. No confrontation, no drama, just a quick look to ease my mind. When I turned onto the quiet street where the tracker said she'd be, I saw her car immediately, parked in front of a modest white house. The curtains in the front window were drawn, but the lights were on inside. I didn't even realize I'd parked until my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. That's when I saw him, Patrick. He came to the door, wearing a casual shirt and jeans, and stood there in the doorway as Sherry stepped outside. She laughed at something he said. And then, they hugged. It wasn't a friendly hug. It was the kind of hug that left no room for doubt. I sat frozen in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought I might snap it in half. The sight of them together, her laughter, the way she leaned into Patrick's arms like she belonged there, it felt like someone had driven a spike through my chest. They didn't kiss. Not then. But they didn't need to. The way her hand lingered on his arm and the way he looked at her. I knew. I didn't want to, but I knew. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, torn between rage and disbelief, my mind scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't completely shatter my world. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe they were just friends. Maybe I was overreacting. But I couldn't stop thinking about Linda's warning, those flirty texts, and now this. Too many pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. When Sherry finally got in her car and drove away, I stayed behind. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. Instead, I turned my attention to the house. Patrick was still standing in the doorway, his phone in hand, typing away. I didn't know what possessed me, but I got out of my car and walked toward him. Patrick. He looked up, startled, his face quickly morphing from surprise to something that resembled guilt. "Oh, hey, Jack," he said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" "Funny," I said, crossing my arms. "I was about to ask you the same thing." He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the empty street like he was looking for an escape route. Just catching up with an old friend," he said, trying to sound casual. "An old friend?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You mean my wife?" His smile faltered. "Look, Jack, it's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped, stepping closer. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've been putting the pieces together for weeks. Now's your chance to come clean. Are you screwing my wife or not?" Patrick's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I shook my head, the weight of his non-answer settling like a stone in my chest. "You're pathetic," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. "I trusted you in my home, around my family, and this is what you do." "Jack, I swear, it's not." "Save it," I said, cutting him off. "You're not worth the air it takes to argue with you." I turned and walked back to my car, my head spinning. I could hear him calling after me, something about it being a misunderstanding, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking I cared about his excuses. When I got home, Sherry was in the kitchen, sipping wine and scrolling through her phone like it was just another Thursday. She looked up and smiled when I walked in. "You're home late," she said, her tone light and casual. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Got caught up running some errands." I couldn't confront her. Not yet. Not until I had undeniable proof. I wanted her to feel the weight of her lies when I finally called her out, to see the look on her face when she realized she couldn't worm her way out of it. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundly beside me, I made a decision. If she thought she could fool me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I woke up the next morning feeling like I was living in someone else's life. Sherry hummed in the kitchen while making breakfast, the smell of bacon wafting through the air as if everything was normal. But it wasn't. Not for me. I sat at the table, barely touching my coffee, while she rambled on about her day. Meetings, deadlines, errands, her words blended together, a monotonous buzz that barely registered. I just nodded and grunted at the right moments, keeping my mask firmly in place. "Are you okay, Jack?" she asked suddenly, her head tilting in concern. "You seem distracted." I looked up at her, studying her face. It was the same face I'd loved for years, the same face I'd trusted without question. But now, it felt like a stranger's. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind with work." She accepted the excuse with a small nod, her gaze lingering for a moment before she turned back to the stove. "Well, don't work too hard," she said lightly. The audacity of her words burned in my chest. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but I held back. Not yet. Later that day, I started laying the groundwork for what I knew would be the inevitable confrontation. I'd already saved the text messages and the GPS logs from the tracker. But I needed more. Something undeniable. Something she couldn't spin into a misunderstanding. I remembered the camera I used for my freelance projects, a small, discreet device with high-quality video and audio. I spent an hour setting it up in the living room, hidden among the books on the shelf, angled perfectly to capture the room where she and Patrick often talked about renovations. I hated myself for doing it. It felt invasive, cruel even. But the alternative was living in the dark, and I couldn't do that anymore. By mid-afternoon, I got my first lead. Sherry had texted me. "Sherry, don't forget, I'll be home late tonight. Big meeting at work. Don't wait up." Another lie. I opened the GPS tracker app, and sure enough, her car wasn't parked anywhere near her office. Instead, it was at a small Italian restaurant on the other side of town. I decided to drive there, parking a few blocks away to avoid being seen. I walked cautiously toward the restaurant, my heart pounding harder with every step. Through the window, I saw her. She was sitting at a corner table with Patrick, a bottle of wine between them. She leaned in as he spoke, her hand brushing his arm, her smile brighter than I'd seen in months. I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching my wife share an intimacy with another man that was supposed to belong to me. It wasn't just physical, it was the way she looked at him, the way her entire posture screamed comfort and familiarity. I couldn't stand there any longer. I turned and walked away, my chest tightening with every step. That night, she came home, smelling faintly of wine and the floral perfume I used to love. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "The meeting went well." I nodded, biting my tongue. "You okay, hon?" she asked, slipping off her heels. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." But inside, I was already preparing for the next step. By the next morning, I was done second-guessing myself. Whatever flicker of hope I'd clung to, that maybe this wasn't what it seemed, was gone. Seeing Sherry with Patrick at that restaurant had extinguished it completely. But if I was going to confront her, I wanted her lies to unravel on my terms. I wasn't just going to accuse her, I was going to prove it, in a way that left no room for gaslighting or excuses. I started my day by reviewing the footage from the camera I'd set up in the living room. It didn't take long before I struck gold. Sherry and Patrick had been at the house just 2 days ago, discussing the renovation. The footage was innocent at first, him measuring things, her pointing out ideas. But then, Patrick had leaned in too close. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laughed, placing her hand on his chest in a way that sent my blood boiling. "I still can't believe you're here so often," Patrick had joked, his voice low. "Your husband must be really trusting." Sherry had smirked, leaning against the wall with a coy look I hadn't seen in years. "Jack's busy. He doesn't even notice half the time." I paused the video, my jaw clenching. The betrayal hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless for a moment. But I forced myself to keep watching. Patrick stepped closer to her, so close their faces were inches apart. "You're playing with fire, you know," he murmured, his tone teasing. "And you like it," she whispered back. That was all I needed. I stopped the recording and sat back, the weight of what I'd just seen settling on my chest like a stone. But this wasn't enough. Not yet. I needed more than words and gestures. I needed irrefutable proof. That afternoon, I set up another camera in the bedroom. I felt like I was crossing a line, like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. But at this point, nothing felt real anymore, not my marriage, not my home, not even myself. Sherry came home that evening, her mood as chipper as ever. She kissed my cheek and started talking about her day, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my own thoughts. "Big plans tomorrow?" I asked casually, testing the waters. She hesitated for a split second, so brief I almost missed it, before smiling. "Not really. Just another busy day at work." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "You deserve a break. Maybe we can do something this weekend." Her smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Yeah, that sounds nice." I couldn't look at her for too long without my anger bubbling to the surface, so I excused myself to the garage, claiming I needed to work on something. The next day, the trap was set. I told Sherry I had a client meeting that would keep me out of the house all day, even into the evening. She barely looked up from her phone when I said it, just muttered, "Okay, have a good day," before heading upstairs to get ready. I parked my car a few blocks away and waited. Sure enough, within an hour of me leaving, Patrick's truck pulled into the driveway. My heart pounded as I watched him stroll into my house like he owned the place. I waited outside for what felt like an eternity, the camera running inside, recording everything. My mind raced with every worst-case scenario, every dark thought I'd pushed down over the past few weeks. Eventually, I couldn't wait anymore. I grabbed my spare key and walked up to the door, unlocking it as quietly as possible. I stepped inside, hearing faint laughter coming from upstairs. I crept up the stairs, my footsteps as light as I could make them, and stopped outside the bedroom door. The laughter had turned into hushed voices, and then, sounds I'll never forget. My chest tightened, my hands trembling as I opened the door without knocking. And there they were. Sherry and Patrick. In our bed. They froze, their faces a mixture of shock and panic as they realized I was standing there. "Don't stop on my account," I said coldly, my voice sharper than I expected. Sherry scrambled to cover herself, stammering something incoherent, but I didn't care. I wasn't listening. I turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind me. The walk down the stairs felt like trudging through quicksand, each step heavier than the last. My vision blurred, but I kept moving. If I stopped, if I let myself truly feel what just happened, I wasn't sure I'd ever start again. Behind me, I heard Sherry's frantic footsteps, her voice breaking as she called out, "Jack. Please wait. Let me explain." Explain? What was there to explain? I had seen everything. I didn't stop until I reached the front door. My hand was on the doorknob when she grabbed my arm, spinning me around. She was crying now, tears streaking her face, her voice trembling with desperation. "It's not what you think," she choked out. I barked a humorless laugh, the sound hollow in the quiet house. "Not what I think." "Really?" Because from where I was standing, it looked exactly like what I think it was. She flinched at my words, her tears falling harder. "Jack, please. Just listen to me. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I cut her off, my voice rising. "This wasn't a mistake, Sherry. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk or leaving the lights on. What you did, what you've been doing, this was deliberate. Planned. Over and over again." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. "Not anymore." "What do you want me to say?" she cried. "That I'm sorry. Because I am. I'm so sorry, Jack. Sorry." I spat the word like it burned my tongue. "You're sorry you got caught, Sherry. That's the only thing you're sorry about." Patrick appeared at the top of the stairs then, dressed hurriedly, his face pale and tight with worry. "Jack, man, let's just—" "Don't," I warned, my voice low and deadly as I pointed a finger at him. "Don't you dare say a single word to me. You don't get to command me. You've already done enough." He opened his mouth to protest, but the look on my face must have stopped him. He turned and slinked back into the bedroom, clearly not brave enough to face what he'd done. I turned back to Sherry, her hands clasped together like she was praying, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Please don't leave. Please, Jack, I love you." The words hit me harder than I expected. Love? Was this what love looked like to her? "You love me?" I said, my voice breaking under the weight of the question. "If this is love, Sherry, then I don't want any part of it." I opened the door and stepped outside, slamming it shut behind me before she could say anything else. The cool evening air hit my face, a stark contrast to the fire raging inside me. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do, but I needed to get away, from her, from the house, from the lies. I got in my car and drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring into streaks of color as I wiped at my face, realizing only then that I was crying. Somehow, I ended up at the same cafe where I'd met Linda just days ago. I sat in the parking lot for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind replaying everything on an endless loop. Sherry's betrayal. Patrick's smug face. Her begging me to stay. And then Linda's words came back to me, "You deserve to know the truth." The truth. That's what I had now. The truth, raw and ugly and undeniable. But knowing the truth didn't feel like the victory I thought it would. It felt like standing in the wreckage of a life I no longer recognized. Eventually, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd saved the video footage from the living room. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. I watched them again, the way they looked at each other, the way Sherry smiled in a way she hadn't smiled at me in years. It hurt. God, it hurt. But I forced myself to watch every second, burning the image into my mind. This wasn't just about catching her. It was about remembering. About making sure I never forgot what she'd done, so I wouldn't fall for her lies again. As I sat there, alone in the dark with nothing but the glow of my phone screen, a single thought crystallized in my mind. This wasn't over. Not yet. I sat in my car outside that cafe until the sky began to lighten, the pale hues of dawn creeping over the horizon. The video had stopped playing hours ago, but the images were still burned into my mind. Sherry. Patrick. Their easy familiarity. The way she smiled at him, a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I didn't know how long I could stay in this limbo, hovering between rage and despair. All I knew was that going back to the house wasn't an option, not yet. By mid-morning, I made the call I had been dreading. "Hey, David," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I need a place to crash. Just for a few days." David didn't hesitate. "Say no more. My door's always open. You want to talk about it?" "Not now," I said. "But thanks." He gave me his usual blunt reassurance. "Take your time. We'll figure this out." When I arrived at David's place, his expression said everything I didn't have the energy to. Concern, confusion, and an unspoken "what the hell happened?" He didn't press, though, just handed me a beer and let me collapse on his couch. "You don't have to tell me anything yet," he said, sitting across from me. "But when you're ready, you know I'm here." For the first time in what felt like days, I let myself relax, just a little. I spent most of that first day at David's house staring at the wall, ignoring the flood of messages and calls from Sherry. I didn't even want to look at her name on my phone screen, much less hear her voice. By evening, David finally broke the silence. "So, you gonna tell me what happened, or do I have to guess?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Sherry cheated on me. With the contractor." David's eyes widened, and he let out a low whistle. "Damn. I knew she'd been acting weird lately, but I didn't think." "Man, I'm sorry, Jack." "I caught them," I said, my voice flat. "In our bed." That hit him harder. He set his beer down, his jaw tightening. "In your house? That's low." "It's more than low," I muttered. "It's like I don't even know who she is anymore." David leaned forward, his voice firm. "So, what's the plan? You can't just stay here forever." "I know," I said. I need to figure out my next move. I don't want to do anything rash." David nodded. "Good. But whatever you do, make sure you're protecting yourself. Legally, financially, everything. Don't let her screw you over more than she already has." That night, I finally worked up the nerve to listen to one of Sherry's voicemails. "Jack," her voice cracked, raw and desperate. "I know you're angry, and I know I deserve it. But please, let me explain. I wasn't thinking clearly, I don't even know why I did it. You mean everything to me. Please, just give me a chance to fix this. I love you." Love. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. If this was her version of love, what the hell had the last 7 years of my life been? I deleted the voicemail and threw my phone onto the coffee table, leaning back against the couch with a heavy sigh. The next day, I met with an attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Lauren who came highly recommended by David's friend. "You're doing the right thing by coming to me now," Lauren said, flipping through her notes after I explained the situation. "The sooner we get ahead of this, the better." I told her everything, about Sherry, the GPS tracker, the video footage. When I mentioned the footage, her eyebrows shot up. "You have a recording?" she asked. I nodded. "I set up a camera in the living room. It shows her and him, well, being too close. And I walked in on them in our bedroom." Lauren leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "That's solid evidence. If this goes to court, it's going to be very hard for her to deny what happened." She explained my options: divorce, separation, even reconciliation if I was somehow willing to go down that path. "What do you want, Jack?" she asked, her voice softer now. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. I want out. I want my life back. And I want her to feel the weight of what she's done. Lauren nodded, her expression resolute. Then let's make it happen. When I got back to David's house that evening, I finally felt like I had a plan. It wasn't much, and it didn't make the pain go away, but it was something. I still hadn't decided when, or if, I was going to face Sherry again. The thought of seeing her, hearing her excuses, made my skin crawl. But I knew that confrontation was inevitable. For now, I just needed time. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The call came 2 days later. I was sitting on David's porch, nursing a coffee and trying to sift through the chaos in my head, when my phone buzzed. It wasn't a text this time. It was Sherry, calling me directly for the first time since I left. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the decline button. But something stopped me. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe I just wanted to hear her flounder for a way to fix the unfixable. I answered. Jack. Her voice was soft, trembling, but it still grated on my nerves. What do you want, Sherry? I said, my tone flat. There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear her breathing. I need to see you. Please. Just, give me a chance to explain. I've already seen enough, don't you think? I shot back. Her voice broke. Please, Jack. I'm begging you. Just let me say my piece. You don't even have to respond. I need you to hear me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Not for her, for me. I wanted to look her in the eyes and see if she even had the courage to admit the truth. The meeting took place at the house. The house that, until a few days ago, had been my sanctuary. Now it felt like enemy territory, but I wasn't about to let her dictate the terms of this conversation. When I walked through the door, it hit me how different everything felt. The photos on the walls, the furniture we picked out together, it all seemed like a lie now, a facade built on a foundation that had crumbled beneath me. Sherry was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, like the guilt was physically weighing her down. Thanks for coming, she said softly, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Don't thank me, I replied, standing a few feet away, arms crossed. Just say whatever it is you need to say so I can leave. She flinched at my tone but nodded, taking a deep breath. I know I've hurt you, she began, her voice trembling. I know I've betrayed your trust, and there's nothing I can say to undo that. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I laughed bitterly. Love? You call what you did love? Sneaking around behind my back for half a year. Bringing him into our home, into our bed. That's love. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I don't know why I did it, she sobbed. I was stupid. Selfish. I wasn't thinking. You weren't thinking. I snapped. You weren't thinking every single time you texted him, every time you met him, every time you let him touch you? That's a lot of not thinking, Sherry. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to understand that it wasn't about you. It wasn't because you weren't enough, it was me. I was scared, Jack. Scared of getting older, of feeling stuck. Patrick made me feel alive again. Her words cut deep, but they didn't surprise me. I'd heard this excuse before, in books, in movies, in stories from friends. It was always about feeling alive. But what about me? What about the life we'd built together? So you felt alive, I said coldly. And what was I supposed to feel, Sherry? When I came home every night, thinking everything was fine, thinking we were happy, only to find out it was all a lie. She reached out toward me, but I stepped back. "Jack, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Please. Give me a chance to make this right." I shook my head, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a physical force. "Make this right? You can't make this right, Sherry. What's broken can't always be fixed." Her face crumpled, and she began sobbing uncontrollably. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something, sympathy, maybe. But it was fleeting. "I can't do this," I said, turning toward the door. "Jack, please," she cried, her voice desperate. "Don't walk away. I love you. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, anything. Just don't give up on us." I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and turned back to face her one last time. "I didn't give up on us, Sherry," I said quietly. "You did." And with that, I walked out, leaving her cries echoing behind me. The days after the confrontation were surreal. I'd always thought that if my marriage ever fell apart, it would be because of life's usual challenges, money problems, health scares, or simply growing apart over time. Not like this. Not betrayal. David let me stay as long as I needed, never prying too much but always ready with a beer or a sarcastic remark when things felt too heavy. But after a week, I knew it was time to stop hiding and face what came next. I had my attorney, Lauren, draft the divorce papers. I'd already shown her the evidence, the texts, the video, everything. She assured me it was an airtight case. And though we lived in a no-fault state, having proof of Sherry's affair gave me leverage, especially when it came to negotiating the division of assets. I didn't warn Sherry when I had the papers served. I didn't see the point. She called me almost immediately, her voice a mix of panic and heartbreak. "Jack, you don't have to do this," she pleaded. "We can work through this. Please. Don't throw everything away." "I'm not throwing anything away, Sherry," I said calmly. "You already did that." Over the next few weeks, I began untangling myself from the life we'd built together. I moved out of David's place and into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with a view of a parking lot, but it was mine. Sherry continued to reach out, alternating between apologies and promises to change. I ignored most of her calls and texts, but I agreed to one final meeting to discuss logistics, selling the house, splitting our savings, everything that came with dismantling a life together. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe neither of us had been to before. She looked different, almost like a shadow of the woman I once knew. Her makeup was minimal, her hair pulled back, and her eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. "Thanks for meeting me," she said quietly. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. We talked about the practicalities, who would take what, how soon we could sell the house, but eventually, the conversation veered into the territory I'd been dreading. "Jack," she said, her voice breaking, "I need to ask you something. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" The question hung in the air between us. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I don't know, Sherry. Maybe someday. But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to how they were. What you did, it broke something in me. And I can't fix that. Neither can you." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know. I'll regret this for the rest of my life." I didn't respond. What was there to say? The day the divorce was finalized, I felt strange. Not happy, not sad. Just empty. 7 years of marriage boiled down to a stack of papers and a judge's signature. I drove back to my apartment that evening and sat in the quiet for a long time, letting the reality of it sink in. It wasn't until a week later, when I received a text from Linda, that I began to feel the first faint glimmer of something resembling peace. "Linda, I heard the divorce went through. I hope you're doing okay. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever and typed back, "Thank you. I might take you up on that." Months passed, and life moved on. The house sold quickly, and I used my share to start fresh. I threw myself into work, picking up more freelance clients and pouring my energy into building something new for myself. I still thought about Sherry sometimes, but the pain wasn't as sharp anymore. It had dulled into something quieter, something I could live with. One day, while I was unpacking boxes in my new place, I found an old photo of us from our honeymoon, smiling, carefree, full of hope for the future. I stared at it for a long time before tucking it into a drawer. It was part of my past, but it didn't define me anymore. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe.